Governing disaster in urban environments, climate change preparation and adaptation after Hurricane Sandy. I was gladly surprised to see that my book, Governing Disaster in Urban Environments, is in a very interesting company in the publisher's website, Roman and Littlefield, along other interesting titles in urban sociology. This is the cover of the book, and I just want to show it. So, some of the remarks made by some colleagues, I feel that they are very poignant in terms of identifying the strengths of the book, in terms of a commentary on climate change and the need for us to better understand how complex it is to live in cities and deal with climate change. Here I have a conceptual map that I developed to provide kind of a guiding scheme for where most of the thinking about the book emerged from. I consider that living in cities, the urban and climate change are complex phenomena, and I address it in the book from an interdisciplinary perspective that is also multi-scalar, from the individual to the communities to the city to the region to the state to globalization, neoliberalism, and other global set of relations. I consider, and this I borrow from Mike Davis, that the city is a paradox. It is the problem because it is the result of industrialization. The classical definition of urban comes from manufacturing industrialization and the emergence of cities as places where many different people gather together, and there is difference and heterogeneity in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And this is when cities emerge, creating a lot of the pollution and the challenges that we face today regarding climate change. But at the same time, it is in the cities, with the retrenchment of the nation state and the government in providing social services, the regulation, privatization, it is in the city at that scale where many climate change policies emerge. I also address the notion of Anthropocene because it opens a space for critically think about the relationship between humans and non-humans, the built environment, organic and inorganic matter. And I also introduce the notion of capitalocene, arguing, and as some do in the literature, that it is capitalism, it's industrialization that have generated the kind of problems that we face today regarding climate change. In that regard, I like to look at the city and the political ecology, how spaces are managed, natural and built, and what are the possibilities for different arrangements. From a structural perspective, I'm also looking at globalization and neoliberalism as the political context in which austerity measures and notions of precarity do have an impact in terms of how the administration of aid as after an extreme climate event are managed. I also have been heavily influenced by Foucault and the notion of governmentality and biopolitics and the management of populations. I think that that is reflective in the book as a way of better understanding the chain of command along the different scales in which aid is administered after an extreme climate impact. And in this case, I am using Hurricane Sandy as an example. Methodological, there are many different methods that I use to work um, on what the book content is about. I use formal and informal interviews, participant observation, archival research of government reports, newspapers, demographics, and climate agreements that I also analyze. This began, and my PhD is in environmental psychology, and as such, I have been for more than 18 years um, working along the lines of what are the environmental issues that we have been dealing with in terms of our relationship with nature. Um, as such, when Sandy hit New York City in 2012, nothing happened in Harlem where I live, but I did see um, horrendous images of the destruction that happened in other areas in the city, in the Eastern Seaboard, in the New Jersey and New York City shore. And I'm a cyclist. I rode with a group, Time's Up, to help in the Rockaways to provide some aid for those communities. My work was an engaged observation, participant observation, and I feel that there was a level of professional embeddedness, circumstantial but nonetheless relevant, to understand the complexity of living in cities and climate change. What is relevant was the constant question I was asking myself to better understand the shocking reality that Sandy produced in the landscapes in the Rockaways. Later on, I also draw from the experience of Katrina. And when I was finishing the book, I'm originally from Puerto Rico. Maria hit the island. So in terms of the Anthropocene and the urban paradox that I mentioned earlier, I see the Anthropocene as an opportunity to reevaluate our relationship with and in nature. And as I mentioned before, the city as a product of industrialization, which poses the city as the problem, but also the solution, as many climate change mitigation, preparation, and adaptation strategies emerge. And I think that from the perspective of globalization, climate change, and urban living, we are all connected politically, economically, and definitely in terms of climate. I had to use this image because I took it when I was helping in the Rockaways, and I couldn't believe that water could split concrete this way. And it might be a little bit sensationalist, but I think that it reflects with great accuracy the level of destruction that Sandy brought to the coast. This is another example. This used to be the boardwalk in the Rockaways that right, this was 1 week after Sandy hit, and these were the conditions in which Sandy left the boardwalk in the Rockaways. This is the level of aid that needs to be deployed to deal with a situation like this. And I just wanted to offer a point of comparison to the next slide, which shows today in the Rockaway. I have been visiting the area every year since Sandy. And this is the new boardwalk. It's made out of recycled materials. There is also a new road, a bike path. This is the public space in the beach, completely redesigned. This is an area that now attracts a lot of people. It's very pleasant, nicely designed, and I couldn't help but to include this picture because I feel that one goes to the beach to forget about time, and here we have, in an urban environment, the memory of a clock or a watch of time. I feel that extreme climate management on the ground responds to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They have developed the whole community approach, and situational awareness as a way to understand the communities that they need to facilitate the distribution of aid. Homeland Security is in charge of terrorism and natural disasters, and in that regard, there is a notion of environmental security that has been articulated by some people to better understand how disasters are administered at the level of aid, of the distribution of aid. Especially after Sandy, many of the governmental reports, especially in New York City, the mayor of New York City at that time, Mayor Bloomberg, the governor Cuomo, all the reports that emerged after the devastation of Sandy emphasize resiliency, and it has become now a buzzword that is ubiquitous throughout climate change preparation and adaptation, not only in the United States, in New York City, but in Europe as well, and around the world. In that regard, I feel that there is a global citizenship that needs to be examined because climate change does not respond to the limiting boundaries of nation states, not with globalization and not with the way that nature operates. In this regard, neoliberal policies and austerity measures are also important to take into consideration because they are the context from which the distribution of aids, the resources, the budgets are allocated. And when the set of circumstances in which this aid is deployed has to take into consideration austerity measures as well. Some of the reactions to Sandy was from a group of landscape architects who resided in Long Island City, and they took upon the task of developing a workbook in which they kind of provided alternatives for how it should redevelop in those areas affected by Hurricane Sandy. In Bangladesh, there is an architect who developed this kind of housing that is green housing, low cost, for flood-prone areas. This is the area in Bangladesh that gets flooding every year. It is where the Himalayas kind of melt and develop the floods when they are coming down to the shore in Bangladesh. The table of contents in the book includes some Hurricane Sandy and the challenges of governing disaster, neoliberalism, globalization, and the urban paradox in climate change governance, post-Sandy disaster and climate governance. Here I am dealing with the notion of resiliency in adaptation and mitigation from many different perspectives, from the notion of resiliency from metals to the notion of resiliency in terms of communities and people who have the ability to bounce back after facing challenges. I also address it from a critical perspective in that resiliency dovetails very appropriately with the notion of entrepreneurship and neoliberalism. I also address alternatives in terms of social and physical redundancies. And as such, I am looking into what are the ways in which we can redesign the physical infrastructure, which seems to be the priority after an extreme climate impact, but also social redundancies in which we can look into how we can strengthen communities and how we can work with the communities that are affected by extreme climate. In that regard, climate change, resilient and redundant social policy also address what are some of those policies that could be implemented to mitigate, adapt, and recuperate from extreme climate. And the last chapter, the conclusions, is tackling climate change, epistemological rifting, governing disaster. And I like to refer to it as an epistemological rift because I think that the notions that we held there based on modernity, security, prediction seem to be upended when we are talking about climate change, when we are talking about the regulation of markets in neoliberalism, and when we are talking about the different scales that all these aspects affect the societies in which we live. In that regard, social capital, the social structure, I feel that the notion of communities of solidarity is a helpful one to help network, develop relief hubs like the ones I participated in which there was not just one agency delivering sandwiches or aids and goods and then leaving after those were delivered, but more a hub of different organizations that came together that 24/7 were available to provide aid to the communities affected. Orly is the resilient design and community engagement in New York City. It's a good example of professionals who live in the areas affected that got involved trying to devise alternative ways to deal with the infrastructure. Um, and Solar Libre it's a good example in Puerto Rico that is bringing social solar power to communities in Puerto Rico. These are just few of the examples that I address in the book as alternatives to develop communities of solidarity that actually tend to emerge almost naturally, if I can use that word, after a climate disaster. Civic engagement after Katrina, after Sandy, and after Maria in Puerto Rico definitely increased. And the book addresses these and many issues that hopefully will provide a point of departure for significant conversations about climate change preparation and adaptation, to open the space for conversations about these topics and to generate more ideas in which we can build communities of solidarity in the urban spaces that we inhabit.